So baie welkom by hierdie Stellenbosch forum. Dis die hier is 'n gereelde geleentheid van 'n lesing, as 'n voorbeeld van 'n lesingreeks waar universiteitsnavorsers, die universiteitsnavorsers het geleentheid gegee om hulle werk op 'n toeganklike wyse met collega's, studente en die algemene publiek te deel. So I'm very happy to see everybody here. This is an example of a lecture series in which the university gives its researchers the opportunity to really share their research much more broadly, and that it's something that we really like to promote. So our speaker today, it's a real privilege, is to welcome Dr. Nick Spall. He's a senior research fellow at a group within our Department of Economics. And the acronym of the group, I think it's RECEP, which stands for Research on Socioeconomic Policy. And his topic today, I think, is extremely important. Primary Education in Crisis, an overview of South African schooling. Very interesting, very relevant. It's also interesting for us in higher education, because we are at the other end of the education system, but that feeds into our system, but it's also extremely important in a broader sense for the country as a whole. And because if it is indeed so, we believe that education is the foundation on which our development and progress as a nation rests, if that foundation is shaky, we have a very serious problem. And Dr. Spall will present an overview of the South African education system, highlighting the inequalities that still exist in the system, which is a big part of the problem. He will also highlight recent international assessments, one of which showed that a staggering 78% of grade 4 learners could not read for meaning in any language. What are the solutions? He will discuss the research which aims to identify what should be prioritized among these many different calls for attention. He's very well placed to discuss this topic. The fact that there's a good number of you here, also a number from our senior management group. So it really shows the importance that we afford this topic. So he's very well placed to discuss this topic. He has a PhD in economics, interests in early grade literacy and numeracy, assessment, evaluation, teacher training and education policy in South Africa. He is recently returned from research visits to Stanford University and the OECD in Paris. He has established himself as a respected researcher and policy analyst of education in South Africa. And he, by what he's doing, he clearly regards it as important to not only provide academic outputs, but to also communicate his research in a way that's accessible to the general public, as a public intellectual. And that is his articles appear regularly in the media. He's got a blog, nickspall.com. It lists more than 30 newspaper articles the past few years. Radio and television programs also frequently use him to provide expert input and comment on education issues. And I must say, because his media outputs is so prolific, he makes it into each of my management reports to Senate and Council in the list of op-eds at the end of my report by thought leaders at Stellenbosch University that I include as an addendum. So in a sense, I'm very glad to bask in his reflected glory. So, and I'm very pleased that more and more of our academics are publishing in the popular media now, because we need to share our scientific output, and it's just as vital as conducting the research of the highest quality. So I'm certainly very interested to hear what Nick says. Welkom aan jullie allemaal, and Nick, thank you very much for this share.
So the aim of the presentation today, I've titled it The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And we're going to look at an overview of the South African education system. So the aim isn't to kind of go underneath the bonnet and try and expose you to all of the technical things that we have to do to get the results. The aim of this is to kind of give a broad brushstroke interpretation of what's going on in the schooling system, and then make sure that we leave time for questions at the end. So all of the stuff that you're seeing might seem quite high level and zoomed out, but if you want to drill down into any of their graphs, we can more than happily do that. Not a particularly groundbreaking approach to this. I'm literally going to be talking about some of the things that are going well in the education system and countering a narrative that I think is quite prevalent that nothing has changed in the South African basic education system. Secondly, talking about some of the things that need to improve, what we're going to call the bad here. And then lastly, touching on some new research that's coming out now as part of a book that is being co-published by Professor Jonathan Jansen, who's also at the university, and myself. We're editing this book.
You'll have to answer them.
Sorry.
No worries. And I think it's better with the lights on than in total darkness. And then at the end, discussing what is to be done. So firstly, let's focus on some of the good things that have been going on in the education system. Jonathan is a good friend of mine, so I think I can put him here even though I'm going to be critiquing both of these statements. The first one is something that came up a while ago, but it formed part of this popular narrative that things are worse than they were under apartheid, or potentially that they haven't changed at all. So Rampeda talks about maths literacy. What is that? It's worse than the arithmetic that I did under Bantu education. And more recently, Jonathan Jansen, in commenting on one of these international studies when it was released, the Progress in International Reading and Literacy Study, the one that was referred to earlier where the 78% of kids can't learn to read. This was his statement. We can now state, without fear of contradiction, that this government's track record on education has been an unmitigated failure. And I think the question which I want to address here is whether or not these statements are true, and explain that they're actually not true. That this is an overstatement of the case. We've got a lot of data in South Africa. It's one of the things that's quite rare for a middle income or developing country to have as much data as we do have in South Africa. So these are just the front pages of various different reports that look at literacy, numeracy, and science, where we take a nationally representative sample of students and we assess them on the same test that everyone internationally is assessing their kids on. So if we take something like the Pearls Literacy Study, which was done in 2016, we were one of 50 countries that participated in that test, and it tests grade 4s in literacy. Everyone does the same test. Those tests are translated in South Africa into all of our 11 languages. Okay. If we had to summarize what we know after doing all of these assessments, what can we see? So what I'm going to do is summarize Pearls, which was done at the grade 4 level, which is reading, SUCMEC, which is done at the grade 6 level, which is reading and maths, and TIMSS, which is done at the grade 9 level in maths and science. And what we can see is I'm going to describe 3 periods, period 1, period 2, and period 3, and this is a summary of all of these data sets. This is a stylistic overview of what's happening here. So the first is that over this period from 1995 to 2002, there was basically no improvement in learning outcomes. We took part in an assessment in 1995, as well as in 1999 and in 2002, and there was no change in mathematics or science outcomes over that period, which is why we call it the stagnating period. But the second period here is the most important period in our view, is that between 2002-3 and 2010-11, there was a significant improvement in learning outcomes. And it was seen in SUCMEC, it was seen in Pearls, and it was seen in TIMSS. These are all independently administered from each other, all run by different organizations. Okay? That growth trajectory is the fastest that we've seen of countries that measure their learning outcomes. It's faster than the improvement in PISA scores in Brazil, for example, which is seen as a really positive reformer. Okay? This is something that's not well appreciated in South Africa, is that there was this period, which I'm calling the improving period, where South African learning outcomes relatively across the board improved significantly. Okay? And then we're starting to see a stalling of that growth from 2011 to 2016. Most notably, the new reading results that came out showed no improvement between 2011 to 2016. Okay? But the TIMSS results, which were the maths and science results, did show an improvement, but a flattening of the trajectory between 2011 and 2015. Okay? So So this is really important to understand, and if you want to interpret the y-axis there, the way we would do it is we would say that a child in 2014, say 20 years after the transition, if we took the average grade 9 child, they were 2 years worth of learning ahead of the average grade 9 child in 1994. Okay? So they were learning 2 years more worth of learning than the kids were 20 years ago. And then the question is kind of what's driving this, and also, as we'll see later, what's driving the stalling? Why is this trajectory coming down? Now you might say, okay, great, but what about traditional measures of performance? Things like the number of people passing matric, the number of people going to university, the number of people graduating. Okay? And if we look at this, these are all studies, graphs from government reports. You can see the same trend between 1993 and about 1999, 2000. You have this very stagnating number, around 275,000 students that passed the matric exam. And then from about 2003 again, 2002, 2003, you see the steep upward trajectory of the number of students that are graduating with matric, the number of students not only that are graduating with matric but qualifying to go to university, bachelor's passes. And probably more importantly than all of these things is this one, which is the number of actual graduates from the university system. And this is showing you from 1986 all the way up to 2014. Okay? This was one of those op-eds that was mentioned earlier, where we were trying to explain this idea of graduate unemployment, and by graduate we mean people with degrees, not certificates and diplomas, is a myth in South Africa. It is a total myth. If you Google graduate unemployment in South Africa and look at some of the work that Safas van der Berg and others, who's the head of RECEP, have done, they show that this is not the case in South Africa, and it's an unhelpful myth. But if we just look at the number of black graduates in particular, this has increased fourfold, right? If we take 1994, there were roughly 10,000 black graduates that the university system was producing, which has now gone up to 48,000, fivefold increase over that 20-year period. Now, of course, those are not the proportion shares of the population. In other words, this is not, we shouldn't be patting ourselves on the back and saying, great, we can stop here. But the point is there has been a significant improvement. This matters for a lot of reasons, right? If we look at unemployment rates by qualification levels, those with a bachelor's degree have internationally comparable unemployment rates if you look at countries like the US or the UK, and that 8% figure is actually even lower now. It's between about 6% of students that have, if you combine bachelor's degree and postgraduate. So this is really important, right? The fact that we have more students reaching matric, we have more students going to university. And also that the learning outcomes, not just of university students and matriculants, are improving, but even when we look at it at the grade 4, grade 6, and grade 9 levels. So that's really important. You need to bank that stat because it's got downhill from here. And the end is particularly depressing, and if we don't recognize that these are both true at the same time, things are improving and they are particularly dire. And we're going to move into the dire part now. But this is the improving part, and I think this often gets skimmed over because we remember how dire the dire is, which we're going to see now. Oh, one last thing. These 5 things I think are also quite standout improvements. We've stuck with the same curriculum for about 10 years now. The curriculum assessment policy statement. Workbooks get distributed very kind of quality color workbooks get distributed to grade 1 to 9 children. 95% of children receive those. 95% of children receive their textbooks on time. 70% of children receive feeding schemes at schools, publicly funded through the National School Nutrition Project. More than I mean, we're not even talking about the child support grant and various other things here, but massive expansion of the year before grade 1, grade R, and a bursary system to train teachers. So there are a number of these different things that we could dig into if we wanted to show that there's a lot that government is doing and started with very, very difficult circumstances. So, moving on to the less great stuff, the bad. So, another underappreciated stat, and this links into, remember when I told you about those 3 phases? The stagnating, improving, and then stalling. The stalling phase, remember we said it was from around 2011 onwards. This is going to show you what happened to student funding from 2011 onwards for basic education. Okay? And what we see is that this is the provincial current per learner expenditure on basic education, and these values are all linked in 2017 rands. Okay. So what's the overarching trend? What we can see is, if you look at the black line, which is South Africa as a whole, in 2010 we were spending 17,800 Rand per learner. In 2019, if we look at the NTEF projections, so 2017 are actual figures and these are projected figures, we see that there's likely to be, well, there already is an 8% decline in per learner, and if we stick to the NTEF, it will be a 10% decline in per learner funding over that same period. Okay? Now, there are a number of reasons for this, and Stellenbosch economics researchers have been the ones that kind of did this. Martin Gustafsson, who's based half with us and half with the Department of Basic Education, has done really important work on what we call the silent ship. So in 2005, there was this very weird 13% spike in births, which is massive for any demographers in the room. That spiked for about 2 or 3 years and then stabilized. Okay? That no one really picked up. It's in the birth registries, it's in grade 1 stats, you can see this. There's a now working paper on our website that's published on this. It's massive, right? So if you have a 13% rise in births in 2005, they're in grade 8 now, by the way, that cohort, that much larger cohort. You're now splitting the same budget over a much larger number of students, which is why per learner funding is going down. Overall funding has been going up by 7% a year, right? But that's not the important one. The important one is per learner funding, because it's per number of teachers that the teacher's teaching, the number of textbooks you have to print and distribute, etc. The second one is above inflation wage increases for teachers. So often we use the CPI index to deflate things, right, to get real figures. That's the wrong index to be using when you're deflating teacher salaries or basic education expenditure. If we spend 100 Rand on basic education, 80 Rand of that is on teacher salaries. So that's the stat that you need to be deflating things by. It's not a representative basket of goods, right? If 80% of your basket is teacher salaries, then that's what you need to weight your CPI for teacher salaries by, which is what we've done in this graph. So this is one of the potential reasons. Remember I mentioned this period 3 of stalling progress. These are some of the types of manifestations of that. Firstly, we have an increase in food poverty levels. Between 2011 and 2015, it rose from 21% to 25%. The number of children experiencing hunger declined over this period and then remained the same over this period. The unemployment rate increased from 25% to 28%. There's been fewer teachers that have been employed. And lastly, I think this is the most damning example of what's happening here in terms of school funding. Class sizes in the poorest 60% of schools have increased from 41 learners per teacher to 48 learners per teacher. In the wealthiest 10%, that increased from 33 to 35. Okay? In terms of realized class sizes, so when we walk into a classroom in a nationally representative sample, you count the number of children in the class, and this increase is directly linked to the decrease in funding that's allocated to basic education. Secondly, we're still in the bad part. But how many students actually make it to university? So this is a really powerful graph, and I think that this is a legitimate success story. But one of the reasons why universities take note of some of the work that we do there in the economics department, this is a study that was done by a doctoral student and Safas van der Berg, where they followed the entire matric cohort of 2008. So every single student that was in matric in 2008, using their ID numbers, following them into and through all universities in South Africa for 6 years. Internationally, this is an incredible data set. I've published a paper on this in terms of gender, and when you present it internationally, the only people that have better data than this on this particular topic are the Nordic countries and the UK, because they can do this and then link it to tax data. Whereas in South Africa, SARS is very scared about talking to researchers about linking, for obvious reasons. So if we look at that cohort of 100 students that start school, 60 will write matric, 37 will pass matric, only 12 will access university. So remember, the entire fees must fall discussion that we're having is about those 12 students. The students that actually qualify to go to university and actually go. And then if we look at completion rates, only 4 students actually complete a degree within 6 years of finishing matric. So of 100 students that started school in this cohort, only 4 got a degree. from university. So that entire segment at the top, and the 6 includes certificates and diplomas, for example. Okay? So that 4 figure is really important and is radically different between racial groups, which we can also talk about if people are interested in that. But the main focus of today is not higher education. The main focus is to say, what about the 60% of students in the cohort? The ones that don't get any kind of qualification whatsoever. They don't get a matric qualification, they don't go to TVET colleges, and they don't go to university. Okay? And we think that a big part of the reason for that is low quality schooling. So in South Africa, we don't have a very large access problem at all. More than 95% of students are in school for the entire course of primary school, unlike all of our neighbors, where those stats are much lower, or other developing countries. What we do have is a big quality problem. In other words, students are in school, but we're asking how much are they actually learning while they're there. So firstly, I'm going to give you a bunch of different examples from these tests. The nationally representative tests that many countries, more than 50 countries internationally take part in. This is one of those tests. John puts 4 boxes on a table as shown below, 1, 2, 3, 4. Which box holds the most? I'm not going to test you on it, the answer's there. In case anyone might not have got that one. Box number 2 is the largest. And in South Africa, this was the first time we tested our grade 5 students. Normally, this assessment it's a second assessment that's only done at grade 9. So we also test our grade 9 students on the grade 9 test. We now test our grade 5 students on the TIMSS numeracy test. And we always take tests 1 year above all the other countries. So our grade 9 students write the grade 8 test, our grade 5 students write the grade 4 test. Okay? And in South Africa, only half of students can answer this question correctly. So this is after 5 years of formal full-time schooling. Okay? So if this is South Africa, where 56% of our students can get this correct, you can see in Indonesia, 91% of students get that correct. But what happens if we broke it down by our wealthiest and we compare our wealthiest and poorest schools? 94% of children in the richest 10% of schools can get this right in South Africa, compared to 34% in the poorest 10% of schools. Now note you'll get 25% correct if you just guess, on average. So they're only performing slightly better than guessing. But what about reading? And this is a focus I only work on reading now, after you'll see some of the reasons why. But a lot of my current work is around reading and early grade reading in African languages. So as has already been discussed, 78% of grade 4 children in South Africa cannot read fluently in any language. This was done on an assessment, and I'm going to show you some of the texts from that assessment later. It was done in all 11 languages. So the way that schooling works in South Africa is that children typically learn in an African language from grades 1 to 3, and then they switch over to English or Afrikaans from grade 4 onwards. So 70% of kids are learning to read in an African language, and by the time you get to grade 4, 90% of kids are learning in English, with the remaining 10% in Afrikaans. Okay? These tests were done in whatever language they were doing in grades 1 to 3. So that if they weren't being tested in English, if they were in a Zulu school, for example. If they were in KZN and the language of learning and teaching was isiZulu, that's the language of the test. The test was available in all 11 languages. Okay? So technically this should be, on average, their home language, and it should also be the language they are most familiar with of all the languages that were assessed. So that means that only 22% of students can read from reading. Okay? Now, if we take another story, and because I think it's quite difficult for people to appreciate texts in languages that they can't understand, I've taken a second study which is called the NEDU study, which was done in 2013, and this is at the grade 5 level now. So this is after they've switched over to English and they've stayed in English for 2 years. Note they've been doing English as a subject, a language subject, since grade 1. So they do English as a first additional language in grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and then they carry on in grade 4 and grade 5. So technically this is after 5 years of instruction in English. This is the story. How leopard got his spots. Many years ago, leopard was a creature with spots, and so on. To give you some context, that 40 words correct per minute, so WCPM means words correct per minute, that's the metric that we use, one of the metrics in reading, to measure success, whether or not you can read, is how quickly you can read. So we would literally sit down with a student, they would read the text, you have the same text, and on your text you're marking whenever they make a mistake. And then at the end of the minute, you only have to do it for 1 minute, you count how many words they got correct in the minute. All of the people in this room would be reading at more than 200 words correct per minute, for example, in English. If you read silently and we said, where did you get up to? Then we went and counted the number of words. In this threshold of 40 words correct per minute is considered a cognitive threshold because if you are reading slower than that, your short-term memory cannot keep all the things in your brain at the same time. Okay? So typically students get to this level in grade 1. If you don't get to 40 words correct per minute in grade 1, in the US you would be taken out for remedial instruction, as an example. Okay? So this is the lowest threshold. You can think about it as a minimum speed limit. If you're not getting to that speed, you can't understand what you're reading. And I'll show you what that looks like. So I'm going to show you just 2 students. The top student is reading at the recommended rate for grade 5 second language learners. This is based on second language learners in the US and some benchmarks that we've developed in South Africa. And the second group, the second learner down here, is about half of our rural students are reading at this rate, which is what 40 words correct per minute looks like down here. Okay? And I'm only going to show you 2 sentences just to give you a sense of what it looks like to read at these different speeds. So the first learner has now finished reading those 2 sentences. And now the second learner has finished reading the sentence. So now I don't show this to you because it makes us feel awkward to see this happen at such a slow speed, right? Imagine if this is your only interaction with text in grade 5. All your books are in English. Even when you're reading in an African language, you're reading at similar speeds. How can you read for meaning? How can you read for pleasure? How can you engage with the curriculum? How can you understand anything that is happening at school, right? This is one of the reasons why the outputs of one of our main projects that we did for 2.5 years called the Binding Constraints Report was, this is the binding constraint in South Africa. The fact that children do not learn to read for meaning in any language by the end of grade 3 is the country's binding constraint. It's not just the educational binding constraint. It's a problem for the economy, it's a problem for civic engagement, it's a problem for anything you can possibly think of. Healthcare access, being an informed citizen, whatever it is. If you can't read for meaning in any language in the first 3 years of school, you literally just fall further and further behind the curriculum. And the way that the South African curriculum is structured is that the first 3 years of school are the learning to read phase, and then from grade 4 onwards it's the reading to learn phase, where you're using the skill of reading to acquire new information. So these students, when they're in grade 5, even though they're not reading even at a grade 1, what are the workbooks that they're getting? What are the textbooks that they're getting? What does the curriculum want them to do? All of those things have steamrolled ahead while they are being left behind, the vast majority of them. And there are a number of reasons why this is the case. It's not just that they don't have the right to texts, which is also true. These texts do not exist in African languages in grades 1 to 3. There are only 285 storybooks that exist in isiXhosa in the world for primary school learners. All primary school learners. So I have all of them on my shelf. I have a picture, it's got 2 shelves. That is the sum total of all books that exist in that language. And that's the 4th largest spoken language in the country. Right? There are various reasons for that. Pansel was a total failure, there's a lack of political will, it's financially complex, there's various things that lead to this. But if we take a step back from reading again and we say, okay, let's look at the schooling system as a whole and ask something like, how do school fees fit into this? How does this differ by school wealth? That stat of 78% that I gave you. Remember, only 22% of kids can read for meaning in their home language by grade 4. How does that differ by school wealth? So this is the poorest 10% of schools, this is the richest 10% of schools. And let's see how many kids learn to read in each of these different sectors. See that in the poorest 60% of schools, less than 1 in 5, less than 20% of learners learn to read in their home language. Slightly better, and then in the wealthiest 10%, more than 70% of kids are learning to read for meaning. Okay? Now, to give you a sense, you might, when you look at the school, you might think, in my mind I'm thinking of Rhenish, or I'm thinking of Stellenbosch, I'm thinking of Polrus, or one of those schools. Those schools are the top 0.1% in terms of fees, which I'm going to show you now. So remember, there are 15,000 primary schools in South Africa, so 1,500 primary schools fit into this. So you wouldn't be able to, I doubt, list 1,500 primary schools. But those are the ones that would fit into that category. So if we look at maths and we break down schools into no-fee public schools, all public schools, fee-charging public schools and private schools, what in maths at the grade 5 level, how does it differ based on these different segments? So in independent schools, 84% of learners are reaching this very low threshold in maths, compared to only 1 in 4 in no-fee public schools. So clearly opportunity is delineated along the functionality of the school, which is almost perfectly mapped onto school fees. Basically, it's a pay-to-play system. If you can pay the fees, you get access to quality education, and we're talking high fees. And we'll see what it means to be talking about high fees. So I told the rector earlier that I'm teaching a class. I taught the first lecture last week, which are many of these slides are coming from. I try and think of ways to make my students remember. So this is called the Wobbly Snowman of fees. 66% of children in South Africa are in schools that pay no fees at all. A further 20% are in what we call low-fee schools that charge between 0 and 2,000 Rand. And a further 9% are in mid-fee schools that charge between 2,000 and 12,000 Rand. These are all per annum figures, so it's per year. Okay? Which means that only 5% of schools in South Africa charge more than 12,000 Rand per year. Okay? So another way of framing this is to say 66% of students in South Africa pay no fees. A further 25% are pay 0 to 5,000. And only 10% pay more than 5,000 Rand fees in the country. Okay? And you might say, well, what about the schools that we know? Where do they fit in? If they're charging 20,000 Rand or more, that's the top 1.8% of schools. Never mind the 40,000, 80,000, or the 250,000 that Hilton College charges. So, to make sure that we have time for questions, I'm going to move on to the IB. So this is new research. This hasn't been published yet, and it was actually preparing for the lecture that I'm teaching the lecture tomorrow on sampling and surveys, and was reading work that Martin Gustafsson and Safas are publishing in a chapter that Jonathan and I are editing, in the book that we're editing. And this is what I'm referring to as waste zones of schooling. And I'll explain now why I've used this terminology. This is not the terminology which they use, and what it means. So if we typically in surveys, what we do is we take all the students, right, and we'll do distributions of what does it look like if we take the distribution of reading. And that's where we get to 78% of students in South Africa cannot read for meaning. It's looking at all the students. Now what these are called maxima distributions, which is saying let's only take the top learner in every single school. So there's literally only one learner. Whatever the highest performing learner is that was assessed, that learner is considered. So if there are 293 schools, there will only be 293 students that you're looking at. What you want to see is what is the kind of ceiling, the sharpest student in that school that got assessed, what level did they get to? Okay? Which are what these distributions are. Now, what they found is particularly concerning, right? This is, I tweeted about this and a lot of people reacted and shared it and stuff, where I said I come across quite shocking statistics all the time, and this one was absolutely flawed, right? So remember we had the low international benchmark. So the way that benchmarks work is you have the low international benchmark, the intermediate benchmark, the high benchmark, and the advanced benchmark. So it's like 4 different levels. Okay? So what we're looking at is they say, okay, so we're not looking at the most basic level of maths. How many students reach the intermediate benchmark? Asking that question. And only the sharpest student in each school. How many of the sharpest kids in every single school, the bright star, you think about it like that, in the school, reach that level? And what they found is that in South Africa, 47% of schools, there was not a single learner that could reach the intermediate benchmark in maths. In Botswana, it's only 2% of schools that cannot produce one learner that reaches that same benchmark. So these are schools where I refer to it as a kind of cognitive ceiling is so low, and I'm going to give you examples of what it means to do the TIMSS international benchmark now. But the important stat here is that half of our schools do not produce even one learner that reaches this level. So this is the description of the TIMSS intermediate benchmark. Students can apply basic mathematical knowledge in a variety of situations, and they go on. For those of you that aren't maths curriculum people, here are 2 examples. Which number is closest in size to 3/4? 0.34, 0.43, 0.74, and 0.79. Okay? These are examples of what it means to be at that intermediate level. Likewise here, number of pieces of paper going up by in 50-page increments, 8, 12, 16, 100, 150. It's just ratio and proportion. Okay? So this is not, the reason why I'm showing this, it's not like calculus. It's not like this is extremely advanced maths that we're asking grade 9 students to do. So grade 9 students, there was not one student in half of our schools that can reach this level of maths. Okay? What about reading? Primary schools and reading. So this is what the intermediate benchmark looks like in reading. Locate, recognize, and reproduce explicitly stated actions, events, and feelings. Make straightforward inferences, basically. And here I've given you an actual text from African rhinos and oxpecker birds. So remember, this was done in their home language, and it's at the grade 4 level. Rhinos and oxpeckers are animals that are they help each other, and so it goes on. And they always ask the questions immediately after the text. So it's not one long story and then lots of questions. It's a short amount of text and then questions that are based on that text, because we take part in an easier version of Pearl's literacy. So you can read the last sentence here. The sharp-eyed oxpeckers stand guard and warn the rhinos of danger by making loud noises and hissing. So the question is, what does the oxpecker do to warn the rhino of danger? It makes loud noises and hisses. So this is what it means to be at the international benchmark in literacy. Okay? And in South Africa, at the grade 4 level, same percentage. 45% of grade 4 classes in South Africa do not have a single learner. The brightest student cannot reach that level. So if we look at both of these, the one on the right is the primary school system, the one on the left is grade 9. And there's no reason why we think these are special grades. We think that what's happening in grade 4 is also happening in grade 3, is also happening in grade 5. And likewise for maths in grade 8, all of it. So I've said here that in half of South African high schools, the cognitive horizons of learners are so severely limited that not a single learner in the class can do basic maths. Okay? Likewise, in primary schools, not a single learner can read and make basic inferences. And this is one of the reasons why I'm referring to them as cognitive waste zones. Okay? It's a term that it prompts kind of visceral reaction. It is a horrible term, I'm not just disputing that. But it's very difficult to think of an adjective to describe this that doesn't sound like a euphemism when you're using it. Oh, there's a crisis in primary schooling. Everyone's like, we know there's a crisis. We know it's a catastrophe. We know it's an unmitigated disaster, as we saw earlier, right? So I think then the question is, if this is what's happening in half of schools, what are the things like the policy implications? And if things are as bad as these surveys are making it out to be, and there's no reason to doubt that they are, there are a lot of different surveys that we see and they're all telling us the same thing. I think we need much bolder and more radical policy interventions in these schools. Maybe not for the entire system. We need a differentiated approach. We may not want to kind of break the only functional schools we have. So, and this is the last slide that I've got to make sure we have time for questions. The question next is, what is to be done? We think, at Reset. The first is to declare that early grade reading in particular, but we could make the same argument for maths, is a national crisis and requires not only being a national priority but significant resources. So So remember I showed you the 10% decline in per learner funding over the period. What happens after the fees must fall and basic education, higher education was declared free for poor and working class students? 57 billion rand was allocated to higher education over the MTEF. Immediately in the last budget in February, an additional 57 billion that was unbudgeted for before that. What's going to happen now, given that next year is an election year, for those of you that understand how South African politics works, teacher salaries are going to be announced in the next month or 2 months, and there'll be a very large increase. I'm not saying that because I know that, I'm saying that because that happens every single year before an election. SATU is the largest union within COSATU, they're in a ruling alliance, and these are the kinds of things that happen in 2018 and 2019 as an election year, which means that per learner allocations go even further down, unless you have an even bigger budget allocation to education. There's also a lot of what I call bullshit talk around the fourth industrial revolution. Everyone is talking about artificial intelligence, the fourth industrial revolution, this is coming, we need to prepare our students for the world of work. They can't read. You don't leapfrog literacy, right? You don't get to coding and talking about all sorts of other things if they haven't even got the basics of how you match spoken words and language onto print, which we can see they haven't. And yet you'll hear the minister, you'll hear the president, you'll hear the people that are the head of NECT, for those of you that know this, that are talking about the fourth industrial revolution and how this we need to prepare. It's like, well, maybe one of the ways that we should prepare is just getting reading right and get basic maths right. Feels like a pretty logical approach to me. So every child should read for meaning by the age of 10. This is not a particularly ambitious goal. It's definitely realizable, it's measurable, and it's something which we can actually do over the long term. Where something like, let's create 1 million jobs, no one knows how to create 1 million jobs. Everyone is lying to you if they tell you that they can create even 10,000 jobs. No one actually knows how to do that, bar public works programs, but even then you're not going to get to 1 million jobs. Taking a back to basics approach, I think that South Africa is quite schizophrenic. We sometimes refer to it as like New Zealand within Uganda. So you've got some parts of the system, and in some ways you can think about it in the same way in higher education. The types of policies that Stellenbosch needs to implement are probably very different to the types of policies that the University of Limpopo or the University of Zululand need to implement. If you were the same rector at the same universities, or at different universities, you would probably implement very different policies. And yet often we try to do a one-size-fits-all. And what we often end up falling back on isn't the majority of the system, we end up falling back on this minority of the system where MPs' children go, where academics' children go, and that's our reference point. So if we took an approach and we said we need one workbook, we need one textbook, we need one set of lesson plans, one story anthology, and we just need to get that right, everyone explodes and says, oh no, we can't do this. This is against the democratic project, fill in the blank, whatever your critique is, right? And yet that's what we need to be doing in the poorest 60% of schools. Secondly, I think that we need to be asking here who has access to that very small, functional, and fee-charging part of the system. So this is part of the negotiated settlement, right? The ideal would have been we said no, there are no fees, because that's one of the ways of discriminating children. So what did we do in the South African Schools Act? We said, because the state can no longer fund these former white schools at the same level as it was under apartheid, because it has many other priorities now, and needs to fund schools that were allocated for black students only and coloured and Indian students, they needed additional funding. So it's not possible to continue funding white schools at the same level. Understandable. One of the things that they said is, okay, but to make sure that those schools still stay in the public system, as opposed to having a white private system and a black public system, which was one of the fears at the time. It was called the Latin Americanization of schools, because that's what happened in Latin America. They said, okay, you can charge fees. But we also put in a clause that says you can't exclude anyone that doesn't pay the fees. So you have these two things, and it's totally schizophrenic legislation. That says you're allowed to charge fees, but you're also not allowed to exclude anyone that can't charge fees. So what do principals do at the moment? And if any of you know principals or are principals, you'll speak to them. They do it in informal ways. We have feeder zones, we have, oh, where do you work? Oh, you work very far away. Sorry, we're full. So the point is, at the moment, only 0.3% of learners receive a fee exemption in the country. So the vast majority of children in fee-paying schools are children that can pay fees, right? If you look at the top 200 schools, high schools in the country, 185 of those schools are former white schools under apartheid. Okay? Those 185 schools produce more maths and science A's than the remaining 6,500 high schools combined. Just those 185 high schools. 57% of the learners in those 185 former white schools are white. I was going to say are still white, but you don't change your race. You don't change your race, right? But the point is, these schools at the very, very top end, the elite, have not deracialized as much as they should have, could have, or should have been forced to do so under legislation. It was a mistake not to implement a policy like this at 1994. It was a mistake then, and it's a mistake now. We could have implemented, and many advisors told the government, international advisors, you can implement a system that provides a quota for no-fee or low-fee kids, that you have to accept that proportion of kids. So if you're at poll risk, you have to accept 20% of kids that cannot pay the fees. Through a lottery system, there are various different ways of doing this. You could legally require even private schools to do this. As a way, yes, it only affects 50,000 learners. Someone out can see it in your eyes who say, oh, this is only a drop in the ocean. Right? You've just shown us only 1.8% of schools charge more than 20,000 rand fees. It's an important drop. That's the drop that comes to university. Right? Is one. And the second one is it's really important from a symbolic level to show that it's not just the elite, it's not just the wealthy, it's not just the people that can pay for fees that can make it, that can go to good schools and get ahead. It's even students that would have otherwise been in those cognitive wastelands. If they got allocated into a low-fee primary school or a high-fee primary school, yes, they might not do as well as other students in that school, but they would do light years better than they would have done in that wasteland that they came from. Right? And yet, for whatever reason, we say, no, this is not the system, this is not the type of system that we want, a more egalitarian system. And this is something that we're pushing for, is that, you know, there are additional ways. The current trajectory that we're on, the current equilibrium that we are in the South African education system, and it is an equilibrium, the forces that keep us where we are now, is not the only one. There are more equitable ones. There are fairer ones, there are preferential ones that we haven't tried or explored, like requiring schools to accept students. How is it that in the same country, we have a school like Hilton College, and I've got nothing against Hilton College, except that it's the highest fee charging school, that's the only reason why I use it. That is the largest school premises in the Southern Hemisphere. It has 4 natural waterfalls on its premises. It charges 250,000 Rand fees a year, right? And this is in the same country where at least 2 children that the media know of, there's now a 3rd child that the media doesn't know of, drown in pit latrines. They fall into a pit latrine and drown in human excrement. We're in the same country. This idea that you can have one country which looks like Stellenbosch, functional roads, the lights come on, the PowerPoints work, all of the stuff, and then within 3 kilometers, 2 kilometers of us, we have schools that could very easily be, if we disaggregated this cognitive waste zone, students that not even one learner will reach an intermediate benchmark. It's not just a challenge to the education system to do something. It's a challenge to the university. It's a challenge to the rector. It's a challenge to everyone that, like, there's more that we can do because the current status quo is not sustainable. To think that we can isolate ourselves, whether we should or shouldn't, it's not possible to isolate yourself in the long run from this type of dysfunctionality in the school system. And the South African system, not just the schooling system, is the most unequal in the world if you compare the 90-10 gap. It's not 99-1, but if you compare the 10%, which is heavily overrepresented amongst white South Africans, 66% of the elite in South Africa is still white. If you look at the wealthiest 4% of the country in terms of wealth, 66% of those are still white, and include many of us in the room. That's unlikely to change without much more radical policies and much more policy relevant work where we're advising government to say this is the best way of doing this, advising people like our deans that are accepting students to say, why are we treating a student that comes from one of these wasteland areas that manages to get 70% in maths against all odds, and yet we give that child the same points as the child that comes from Paul Roos and gets 70% for maths. That is ridiculous. We've got the data, we can do much better, right? That student that can get 70% for maths in an extremely disadvantaged context. If we could measure things like resilience and grit, social-emotional skills, all the things that we know are really important for success at university, that student would be light years ahead of a whole bunch of other students that are getting just 70% and scraping by. So I think that's the challenge which I'd like to leave you all with, is that I think a lot more can be done. Thanks.